20 years ago, something amazing happened. Well, technically not 20 years ago. The idea came into a developer's head a couple years beforehand, leading his studio to ditch their game about a girl with a stick and instead work on one about going from planet to planet collecting weapons and gadgets. It was 20 years ago, rather, that we received the end product, a future retro platformer shooter about a fuzzy mechanic traveling from planet to planet collecting, well, you know. In the years to come, we'd see many sequels, comic books, merchandise, and even a movie. But none of this would happen if the first game didn't succeed. It's easy to overlook the 2002 release of Ratchet and Clank as primitive to what would follow, but I assure you, there is some real magic to be found with the original game. Speaking personally, I associate the first game the most with my early years. For one, it was the first game I ever played. According to my dad at least. In a lot of ways, this game is an infant in its own right, still finding its footing, still figuring things out. And this is true of most first entries in any given game series. The first level reflects this feeling of being rough around the edges. Unlike platforming contemporaries Jak, Mario, and Banjo-Kazooie, Ratchet's homeworld of Veldin is no pushover. Don't get me wrong, it's still the first level, so challenge is the least of your concerns. But the Kizzle Plateau is just that, a plateau. Stray far enough from the critical path and Ratchet is sent plummeting to his demise. Aesthetically speaking, it's also far more barren than Peach's castle courtyard or Jak's geyser rock. The trees you find look dead, any vegetation is more likely than not some ugly weeds, and the general landscape isn't very easy on the eyes. If you think this is an oversight by Insomniac though, you'd be wrong. Narratively, the game shows up in the first few seconds of cutscenes that Ratchet kind of hates it here too. It'd make a lot less sense for him to want to leave a lush forest or some colorful plains after all. Veldin is the Solana Galaxy's version of a run-down rural town. Dull, uninteresting, and inclined to make you dream of grander ambitions. Luckily for Ratchet, and the player, who probably isn't too impressed with the first level scenery, Clank comes to the rescue by crash landing a brief jog away. The first conversation the duo share is a sneak peek of things to come. Clank is calm, reserved, and straight to the point, coming off a bit strange and definitely naive. After speaking his first 8 words, the next sentence to come out of Clank's mouth is,
"Currently I'm in search of someone who could be of assistance in saving the solar system."
He says this to a stranger he has only just met. To be fair, he was born not even yesterday. Ratchet, on the other hand, is a lot more energetic, talkative. He's got the street smarts that Clank clearly lacks, but as we'll come to see, his weakness is getting lost in his own fun and distracted from what really matters. But then again, who can blame him? While Veldin is colorless, void of life, and actively discourages straying off the beaten path, Planet Novalis is the complete opposite. The Tobruk crater is the game's real opener, and as the developers finally let up on the exposition, there's almost too much to take in here. A valley town under attack, the industrial waterworks pumping away, the murky caves begging to be explored. This is exactly what Ratchet's been waiting for, and then some. Despite being just 5 minutes in gameplay-wise, it feels as though the training wheels have been ripped off here. No more linear, rigid paths to the goal. Pick one of 3 distinct routes and see what you come across, each with its own treasures and goodies for those that check every nook and cranny. Bottomless pits are replaced with pools of water, there's more in the way of vertical ascent and descent that Veldin never had, and the general atmosphere is far more enticing and inviting. This is in spite of Tobruk Crater being under attack. We still need bad guys to smash to bits, after all. Ratchet's home was uninhabited, and enemies were placed fairly sparsely. Novalis, meanwhile, has its enemies present all throughout the valley and even inside the caves. The planet is also home to an actual population, and as such, Ratchet and Clank get to speak to 2 of the planet's residents, the mayor and the plumber. Things feel very lived in for PlayStation 2 standards. Ratchet's shipbox of a spacecraft is soon replaced by the mayor's courier ship, which lets the player pick and choose the planets they'd like to visit to or return to next. While the importance of the game's non-linearity has waned on me after the first 100 playthroughs, it needs to be stated that there is a healthy amount of player freedom on offer. The paths in each level may be linear, but the order in which they're carried out is almost completely in the player's hands. Combined with all the hidden goodies scattered throughout these planets, it truly feels like an open adventure for first-time players. Immersive loading screens of Ratchet's ship flying through the cosmos sell the feeling of traveling across the galaxy. Add to the fact that no 2 levels ever look quite the same, and the Solana Galaxy seems as vast as it can be. Ratchet and Clank will visit volcanic depots, bustling cities with vegetative overgrowth, space stations located at the farthest reaches of outer space, and everything in between. Again, empathizing with Ratchet is a lot easier when one takes a step back and realizes he's just as blown away as we are by the locales we get to visit. Ratchet does end up getting carried away though. Clank is laser focused on finding Captain Quark, who he thinks could help in stopping Chairman Drek. Drek is a corporate overlord who wants to make a new planet out of the pieces of others, whether the inhabitants like it or not. These are quite serious stakes, as these planets are basically toast once Drek's through with them, but Ratchet is having way too much fun to care. Going on a galaxy-wide getaway vacation will probably do that to you. There are also all the cool new toys he gets to play with. Whether he's found it out in the wild or bought it from the local Gadgetron vendor, shooting things is just so much more fun than working on spaceships all day. And here I'll take the opportunity to pivot discussion toward the actual gameplay systems offered in this first outing. When pitted against his successors, the combat in the first Ratchet and Clank is easy to dismiss as primitive. Taken on its own, however, there is something unique to be enjoyed here. The original entry plays less like a shooter with its combat and more like a resource management pseudo-puzzle game. That's quite the niche label, but I've hesitated in finding anything similar to it, so I suppose the game is deserving of it. Enemies are more often than not placed in ways that see the player approach the scenario less like an encounter and more like a puzzle to be solved. Ratchet's foes are almost always laid out directly in front of him, meaning the player knows exactly what they're up against before engaging. From a distance then, the player decides how best to approach the fight, and this is where the weapons come in. These are not really guns you'd find in a standard shooter. You might have the blaster and the flamethrower archetypes present and accounted for, but most of the arsenal in Ratchet's first outing consists of specific use weaponry. There's mines, decoys, remote-controlled missiles, supercharged boxing gloves, and more. With such a variety of weapons, the player soon develops a number of options for how to approach a given enemy setup. Some weapons are better than others for certain situations, but the inclusion of finite, expensive ammo is what keeps players on their toes. On top of determining what weapon is best to use, consideration must be made for what the player can afford to use, or there will be consequences. For example, the Visibomb packs a bigger punch than any other weapon and can be used from total safety, but it costs 100 bolts to fire each missile. If it's not used sparingly and only for the most threatening of encounters, it's going to drain your bank account. This is true of most of the game's powerful weapons, whether it be the Glove of Doom, Devastator, or the drone device. Ratchet and Clank not only tests player knowledge on how to approach an encounter with the tools available to them, but also tests their ability to find the most cost-effective solution to each of these encounters. This is quite an interesting approach, and as I've mentioned before, this does lead to Ratchet and Clank feeling like a completely unique gameplay experience. However, some issues do arise as a result of this system, the most prevalent one being that buying weapons for the first time feels like a bit of a dice roll. Remember, bolts are very important because you need them to buy ammo, obviously, but the game also entices you to buy new weapons that carry some fairly hefty price tags. These weapons often have a single specific use, and if the player doesn't favor the gameplay the weapon encourages, they walk away disappointed, having wasted their bolts. A simple firing range or arena that allows Ratchet to test these weapons before purchasing would have remedied the issue, and it does come 2 games later. But at that point, most weapons have been streamlined for general use, so it's a bit too late anyway. As it stands in the first game though, your first playthrough can be a bit of a stumble as you figure out which guns you like and which ones you wish you could refund. On top of this, players who haven't been searching thoroughly through each level and smashing every crate are going to be much worse off than others, which leads to near constant limitations on which weapons can be used. The experience undoubtedly gets better the more you play and figure things out, but some players may just get up and leave if that process takes too long. This is something I can't comment on personally because I know this game so inside and out that resource management is no longer a concern. However, on my most recent playthrough, I went out of my way to handicap myself by not breaking any crates until about halfway through the game. I also did my best to avoid any advanced movement that newer players wouldn't be able to perform in the middle of combat. These 2 limitations added a good amount of tension and made me think about encounters in the ways I've been describing. It was a fun experience, though again, I can't say it's for everyone. Ratchet and Clank also doesn't follow a traditional RPG in the way that the player gets more powerful as they play. Rather, you're presented with more and more things to tinker around with. Weapons are for sale and can be found throughout various planets, but so are gadgets, which open up puzzle-solving opportunities, ways to obtain bolts, additional firepower, and on the whole, new gameplay experiences. There's rarely a planet that doesn't require the use of at least one of these gadgets, and for the first half of the game, you are treated to a near constant stream of new toys to play with. It's very satisfying. Shifting again to a different topic, the soundtrack only adds to the primitive feeling of the game, but by no means am I calling the music itself primitive. Rather, I'm referring to the compression of these tracks, which wasn't intended to happen, but nonetheless gives the game a very retro soundscape. This is in combination with a very techno-like direction, not as serious in tone as later entries, which makes the soundtrack here stand out as something totally unique. There's much in the way of mechanical or industrial motifs added in to make the appropriate levels feel appropriately at work. The more threatening landscapes are accompanied by less catchy, more ominous themes that raise attention. Busier, more populated locations are given a sense of both awe as well as the hustle and bustle that's appropriate for these locales. It's very well put together. Back to the story. The impending danger Drek brings is apparent in just about every level, but it's clear that Ratchet likes having all these locales to visit, and bad guys to shoot to Kingdom Come. He shrugs off the strength of the Blarg, and sees most of the infobots as commercials, advertising what he'll get to experience next. To be fair to Ratchet, this is exactly what they are, but it seems that only Clank looks beneath the surface level in this regard. To Clank, coordinates to new planets are new opportunities to find Quark or Drek, a means to an end. While Ratchet probably hopes the journey goes on forever. Ratchet is focused only on the journey, while Clank only sees the destination as being important. This is where the conflict between the two comes from. So we continue to look for Captain Quark, Clank hoping his naive assumptions about the hero guy being willing to save the galaxy is true, but of course, it's not. As it turns out, Quark, like everyone else in Solana has been so far, is only really concerned with himself and his pockets. For most characters we've met, this has boiled down to holding out and giving infobots and gadgets away, and instead asking for our cold hard cash, even if we save them.
Sell? After we just saved your scrawny butt?
All right. I'll give you the employee discount too.
For Quark, this means working with Drek to promote his new planet, and growing in both wealth and status along the way. Ratchet and Clank have thrown a wrench into things, being that they're the only ones that aren't in it purely for the money. Well, at least Clank isn't. Ratchet is very much drawn in by the same enticements that corrupted Quark, and it doesn't hurt that Bolts also buy all the cool guns he loves to shoot. Regardless, Quark tries to get rid of the pair, but fails. Here, character motivations change, but only in name and not in spirit. Ratchet, still concerned only with what he wants, sets his sights on finding Quark and getting revenge. Clank, realizing that Quark isn't the savior he was hoping for, endeavors to find and stop Drek, presumably with Ratchet's help. But he's a little preoccupied with the whole revenge thing, and this is the primary conflict of the game's second act. Clank has to convince Ratchet to be a hero and do the right thing in stopping Drek. It's a pretty strenuous stretch of cutscenes, and the tension between the two feels genuine. If you're Ratchet, you'd probably be bothered by this tiny robot who knows nothing about the real world, egging you on to save the galaxy at your own risk. Can't a man go to planet Hawaii in peace? If you're Clank though, the threat Drek poses is clear to see, and it's frustrating that the only person halfway willing to do anything about it is caught up in total nonsense. There are hints of progress. Ratchet shifts slowly from, I'm not after Drek, to, if we get him, we get him, and eventually comes full circle at the Gimlik moonbase. This comes only after exacting his revenge on Quark, but Ratchet realizes immediately what his inaction against Drek has brought: misery and suffering for thousands. So with both Ratchet and Clank finally on the same page, we set out to find and stop Drek. Not long after, the stakes are amped up to 11 when it's revealed Ratchet's homeworld of Veldin is next in line for total destruction. It's a race against the clock as the two infiltrate Drek's fleet and get to the command center of his ship, but as fate would have it, Drek's on Veldin. I mentioned earlier that making the first level of the game look the way it did was far from a mistake. The narrative motivation for Ratchet to leave Veldin is one thing, and the contrast in gameplay another. But the biggest payoff from having Veldin look unsightly is having the player return here for the game's final level. Night has fallen over the Kizel Plateau, and if the place looked a little bit drab before, it is downright intimidating now. It's a fantastic design choice, the same path we treaded at the beginning of the game, repurposed for one final gauntlet of a level. Those taser bots seem like a distant memory now, replaced instead with elite troops, tanks, and flying artillery units. If there was any doubt before, it's spelled out clearly that this is the final level. Ratchet's come a long way, having amassed a huge stockpile of weapons and gadgets, all put to the ultimate test as he heads deeper and deeper through the plateau, past Clank's crash site, along cliff sides over bottomless chasms, and finally to the deplanetizer where Drek is waiting for them. There's a long boss fight to overcome, but the game stops in the middle of it for Drek to reveal the big twist. He's not doing the planet building thing for his displaced people, he's doing it for money. You probably saw this coming after having to pay everyone for everything throughout the game, but it's a nice twist nevertheless. Because this is a video game and the player must win, Ratchet and Clank do win, sending Drek onto his own planet only to blow it to smithereens. Doing this puts the two in a bit of a gray area in terms of how ethical it is to blow up a finished planet, one that probably could have housed all the displaced residents of destroyed planets, but we have to remember this is a kid's game. Mission accomplished. Time to roll credits, but not before Ratchet solidifies his friendship with Clank, the two of them walking off together into the night. The end. Except we have at least 10 more games after this, but I think you know what I mean. Speaking as someone who prefers the later entries in their style of gameplay, I mean it when I say there is a lot to enjoy in the duo's original outing. Rough around the edges is the best way to sum it up. A lot is being done in the way of experimenting to try and figure out what Ratchet and Clank's gameplay should be. The plethora of sequels that come after smooth out those edges, refining combat to perfection, adjusting movement to be more precise, focusing on different themes, and presenting other takes on the nature of the galaxy and the people living in it. With so much in the way of improvement having come afterward, deciding to play the original Ratchet and Clank may seem like you're taking a step backward. And in some ways, you are. But there is truly something special waiting for you on the other side. If you don't mind adapting to the game's unique combat system, strict economy, and loose controls, you might find out why those sequels came in the first place. There is a charm to this commercial universe, and as far as origin stories go, you can't do much better than this. If you treat it less like a shooter and more like a platformer with resource managing shooting puzzles, you might find something to appreciate. I sure do. Despite all the jank, I haven't played anything like it, and whether it's bad or not, that certainly counts for something. But it's not bad. It's great. A product of its time for sure, but man, what a time capsule.